The morning shift at Lakeshore Grounds started at 5:45, and Everett Coombe was always there before the lights came on. He had a routine that hadn't changed in 11 years. Park the truck around back, the old Ford F-150 with the cracked passenger mirror he kept meaning to replace. Unlock the service entrance with the key that stuck a little in cold weather. Walk through the dark kitchen, flip the hood fan first, then the percolators, then the reach-in coolers one by one. By the time the morning cook, a 23-year-old named Danny, arrived at 6:15, Everett already had a pot of dark roast going and was usually sitting at the small prep table near the back window, reading whatever paperback he'd picked up at the Sally Ann on Elgin Street. He didn't look like much. That was the honest truth of it, and most people in Almonte, Ontario, would have said so without meaning harm. He was 54, broad in the shoulders but soft around the middle, with the kind of hands that told you he'd spent time doing real work before whatever he was doing now. His hair had gone silver at the temples and stayed there for a decade. He drove a truck that had seen 3 Ontario winters too many. He wore the same rotating set of flannel shirts, dark green, dark blue, one burgundy, and a pair of steel-toed Blundstones that he resoled rather than replaced. He owned Lakeshore Grounds outright, had for 6 years, but most of the customers, and even a few of the staff, thought he was just the manager. He let them think it. His daughter Megan had told him once, she was about 16 at the time, already sharper than most adults he knew, that he had a gift for disappearing in plain sight. He'd laughed at that, said it wasn't a gift, just a preference. She'd given him a look that said she didn't entirely believe him. Megan was 21 now, studying environmental science at the University of Guelph. She called on Sundays and texted during the week, usually links to news articles about watershed policy or photographs of her lab work. He kept every photograph. He had them printed at the Shoppers Drug Mart on Mill Street and pinned them to the corkboard above his desk in the back office. Some of the newer staff had seen the corkboard and assumed the young woman in the photos was a niece or a family friend. He let them think that too. Everett had raised Megan alone since she was 9 years old. Her mother, his ex-wife Donna, had left Almonte for Calgary with a man she'd met at a conference, a financials consultant named Bradley, who wore suits that cost more than Everett's truck and had opinions about wine that he shared whether or not anyone had asked. The divorce had been civil on paper and painful everywhere else. Donna had offered to take Megan. Megan had looked at her father and said, without drama and without hesitation, that she wanted to stay. He hadn't cried in front of her. He'd waited until she was asleep. That was 12 years ago. He'd figured out the rest as he went. School lunches and parent-teacher nights and the specific misery of shopping for a teenage girl's birthday present when you have no idea what you're doing. He'd learned. He'd made mistakes. He'd shown up. That was the whole of it, really. He'd just kept showing up. Renata Bosch arrived in Almonte in April. She came from Toronto, that much was obvious from the car. A leased Audi Q5 in a shade of gray that didn't belong on a 2-lane road that still had frost heaves in it. She was 41, recently separated from a man named Graham Bosch, who ran a mid-sized logistics company in Etobicoke, and she'd taken a 6-month lease on a renovated Century on Pakenham Road, because she needed, as she put it to her friends, a reset. She was beautiful in the way that made rooms adjust when she walked in. Not loud about it. She had good taste, wore it lightly. But it was there, and she knew it was there, and she'd learned early that it opened doors and created a particular kind of patience in people who might otherwise have less of it. She was not a bad person. She was, however, a person who had spent a long time in rooms where what you drove and where you summered and what your husband's company's revenue was told you something essential about who you were. That kind of atmosphere gets into you. It takes time to notice it. She came into Lakeshore Grounds the first week of May on a Tuesday morning because the other cafe in town didn't open until 8, and she needed coffee at 7:15. She ordered a flat white, which wasn't on the chalkboard menu, and the young woman behind the counter, Priya, 20, very competent, said she could make something close to it. Everett was at the counter doing inventory on a clipboard when it happened. He looked up when Renata asked her question, not because it was a complicated order, but because the voice had a particular quality of being accustomed to requests being accommodated. "We can do that," he said, setting down the clipboard. "Give me 2 minutes." He made it himself. He'd learned espresso properly years ago before he opened the cafe. taking a course in Ottawa that Donna had thought was a strange thing to spend a weekend on. The flat white came out right. Renata took a sip and looked up with genuine surprise. "That's actually very good," she said. Not as a compliment exactly, more as a discovery. "We try," he said, and went back to his clipboard. She came back the next day, and the day after that. By the third week, she was coming in twice a day, morning and early afternoon, and Everett had learned her order by then. The flat white in the morning, a plain Earl Grey with no milk in the afternoon. He didn't make conversation for the sake of it. He wasn't a man who felt the silence needed filling. But she had begun to linger at the counter instead of taking her coffee to one of the tables. And he found himself talking with her in the natural way that sometimes happens between people who recognize something familiar in each other without being able to name it precisely. She told him she was a graphic designer, that she'd had her own studio in Toronto for 7 years, that she was taking a break from client work to see if she still wanted to do it. He said that sounded hard, the not knowing. She said yes, it was. He didn't tell her much about himself. Not because he was hiding anything exactly, but because there was a lot to explain, and most of it didn't tell itself quickly. He said he ran the cafe. He said his daughter was at university. He said he'd been in Almonte a long time. She didn't ask deeper questions, not then. She was, he suspected, not yet in the habit of being curious about people who weren't, on the surface, remarkable. He noticed this without bitterness. He'd noticed it his whole life. By June, they had fallen into something that neither of them had formally agreed to, but both of them understood. He brought her coffee before she asked for it when she came in. She saved him the corner table by the window, the one with good light, when she was there ahead of him on his breaks, even though he'd told her he rarely sat down. He found himself watching the door around 10:15, which was when she usually arrived. She asked him to dinner in the straightforward way she did most things, with a directness that he appreciated. He said yes. They went to a place in Perth, 40 minutes east, because they both knew that Almonte had eyes and they weren't ready for that. The dinner was easy. He laughed more than he'd expected to. She ordered the duck and ate it without making a production of it, which he took as a good sign. Afterward, they walked along the river for a while in the late June light, and she put her hand through his arm in a way that felt like she'd been doing it for years. He drove her home. She invited him in for tea, the kind of invitation that means something else, and he said he had an early morning and meant it, and she'd looked at him for a moment with an expression that mixed irritation and interest in equal measure, and he thought, driving home, that this was probably going to be complicated. It was. The summer was the best he'd had in a long time, longer than he wanted to count. He wasn't a man who used the word lonely because he'd been too busy being the thing Megan needed him to be. But there had been something missing that he'd learned to treat as a fact of his life the way you treat a permanent ache. Renata, as it turned out, had a way of making the ache quiet down. She met Megan in late July, when Megan came home for a weekend. Megan shook her hand, said, "Nice to meet you," and looked at her father with the particular expression she'd developed over the years for situations she was reserving judgment on. Later, while Renata was in the bathroom, Megan leaned over to him and said quietly, "She's very put together. Is that bad?" he asked. Megan considered it. "I don't know yet," she said, which was the honest answer. He appreciated that about her. She'd always given him honest answers, even when they weren't easy ones. The cracks showed in September, and they showed the way cracks usually do. Not suddenly, but with a slow accumulation of small things that you catalog without naming. Renata's friends from Toronto visited over the long weekend. There were 4 of them, couples, and they arrived in 2 vehicles that cost more than Everett's Café's annual property tax and filled the Century House on Pakenham Road with a particular kind of noise that had nothing to do with volume. They were not unkind to Everett. They were simply, unmistakably, men and women who had spent a long time around other men and women like themselves. The first evening there was a dinner. Renata had cooked. She was a good cook, another thing he'd come to appreciate, and the conversation went around the table the way it does in those groups. Revenues and real estate, and the specific grievances of people who have enough that their problems have become luxurious. One of the men, a fund manager named Stewart who had the wide, settled confidence of someone who has never once doubted that the room's interest was on him, asked Everett what he did. Everett said he ran a cafe in town. Stewart nodded in the way that closes a subject rather than opens it. He noticed Renata's expression shift, just slightly, across the table. It was the shift of someone recalculating. He didn't say anything about it. He finished his dinner and helped clear the plates and said goodnight to everyone with the same quiet courtesy he applied to most situations, and drove home. Later, he lay in the dark of his bedroom and thought about the shift in her expression, and what it meant, and whether it was the kind of thing that passed or the kind that stayed. It stayed. October came. She was less present, not gone, but present the way a song is when it's playing in another room. She had started taking calls from Toronto clients again, and the calls made her animated in a way that their evenings together sometimes didn't. She mentioned once that she'd been thinking about going back. Not permanently, just to see. He said he understood. She looked at him as if she'd expected an argument and wasn't sure what to do with the absence of one. In November, she told him about Randall. She didn't lead with his name. She led with a version of it that was meant to soften the shape of it. Someone I've known for a long time, and it's complicated, and I didn't plan for any of this. Randall Sinclair was 56, a property developer out of North York, with holdings across the GTA and a reputation in certain circles for the size of his appetite for acquisition. He was divorced, no children, and he had been, Renata explained carefully, attentive in a way that she found difficult to set aside. Everett listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator hum. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "I understand," he said. She looked at him with something that might have been frustration. "That's all you're going to say?" she said. "What would you like me to say?" She didn't answer that. He thought, afterward, that she might have wanted him to argue, or to make her feel worse about it, or to be the kind of man who made decisions for her. He wasn't that man. He drove home. He did not cry this time, either, but it was closer than he'd have admitted. What Renata Bosch did not know in November, or in the months leading up to it, or in the months that followed, was any of the following. She did not know that Lakeshore Grounds was not the whole of what Everett Coombe owned. It was, in fact, the smallest piece. She did not know that in 2009, during what everyone else in the country was treating as a reason to sell, Everett had spent 14 months buying up distressed commercial properties across the Ottawa Valley, Renfrew, Pembroke, Arnprior, Carleton Place, at prices that a man with patience and some cash on hand could find if he was willing to look. She did not know that over the following 12 years those properties had been renovated and leased, and in some cases, sold at returns that a Bay Street analyst would have found interesting. She did not know about the Portfolio Management Company, incorporated in Ontario in 2014, which Everett ran quietly with a woman named Frances Odell, a former commercial banker from Kingston who'd worked with him since the beginning and who handled the parts that required a suit and a boardroom. She did not know that Frances held the meetings while Everett stayed home, because that was the arrangement. And it had always worked, and neither of them saw any reason to change it. She did not know that Megan's university tuition had been paid in full, in advance, on the day she was admitted, without mention of a scholarship or a loan. She did not know the number. The number, if it had been put in front of her, would have rearranged her understanding of every conversation they'd ever had. Everett knew this about himself, that he moved through the world in a way that made people reach the wrong conclusions. And he had never particularly tried to correct it. He wasn't performing humility. He simply had no interest in the version of himself that money made possible if you wore it on the outside. He'd grown up with a father who wore his money on the outside, loudly and consistently, and he'd watched what it did to the man and to the people around him. He had decided very early that he would rather be underestimated by the wrong people than performed for by the right ones. The only person who had always known him fully was Megan. He called her the Sunday after Renata ended things. Megan listened the way she did, quietly, completely, without the reflexive reassurances that other people offered. "Dad," she said after a long moment. "I'm fine," he said. "I know you are," she said. "I'm just thinking about how she drove that car all summer," Megan said, "and never once asked you anything about yourself." He hadn't thought about it in those terms, but she was right. Renata had asked him things. His opinions on books, on the weather, on the restaurant she was thinking of trying in Perth. But she had never asked him the kind of questions that required an answer you had to think about. She'd taken the surface of him and catalogued it and made a determination from it, and she hadn't looked underneath because she hadn't thought there was anything underneath worth finding. He told Megan he'd see her at Christmas. She said to bring the shortbread he always made, the kind with the lemon zest, because her roommates had been asking about it since last year. He said he would. After he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold and thought about the brisket he had going in the smoker at the cafe. And whether Danny had checked it in the last hour, and whether the reach-in cooler on the left side had been making that noise again that meant the compressor needed looking at. He got up and drove over to check. The letter came in February. It came from a law firm in Ottawa, Calloway and Price, with an address on Sparks Street, and it was written in the measured, dense language of estates, which Everett read carefully and then sat down on the kitchen table and read again. His uncle, Harold Coombe, had died at 81 in January at his home in West at Vancouver. Harold had been estranged from most of the family for the better part of 2 decades, the result of a dispute over the family property in the Gatineaus that had ended relationships and rearranged Christmas dinners for years. Everett had seen Harold twice in the last 20 years, once at a funeral and once by accident at a home hardware in Pembroke, where they'd stood in the fasteners aisle for 40 minutes, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. Harold had no children. His wife, Agnes, had predeceased him by 3 years. The letter explained that Everett was the primary beneficiary of Harold Coombe's estate. Harold, it turned out, had spent 50 years quietly accumulating real estate, primarily in British Columbia and Alberta, but also a private investment vehicle with stakes in half a dozen companies that had, over the decades, matured into something considerable. The estate had been assessed. The number was in the letter. Everett read the number twice. Then he put the letter down and finished his coffee. He called Frances Odell that afternoon and read her the relevant sections. Frances was quiet for a moment, which was not something she was often. Then she said, in her even, considered way, that this changed the scope of things somewhat and that they should probably sit down with the lawyers before the end of the month. He said he'd call them tomorrow. Then he drove to the cafe, put on an apron, and started the prep for Thursday's soup. He did not tell Renata. There was no reason to. She had been with Randall Sinclair for 3 months by then, and from what he understood, small town, short winters, long memories, it was going well. Randall had visited Almonte once, in December, and had driven through in a black Range Rover that several people mentioned to Everett with a particular kind of sideways care that they thought was subtle. He wished her well, he meant it. What he didn't expect was the phone call in March. He was at the back of the cafe sorting invoices when Priya came and said there was someone asking for him at the front. He assumed it was a supplier. He went up. Renata was standing near the window, in a wool coat he hadn't seen before. With her hands in her pockets, she looked the same. She also looked like a person who had rehearsed something. He said hello? She said hello. Then she said his name in a way that added something to it, and he could feel the shape of what was coming. She said she'd been thinking, that she'd made a mistake, that she'd been afraid of something she couldn't quite name, and she'd let that fear make a decision for her that she should have made herself. She said she thought they'd had something real, and she wasn't sure she'd treated it as carefully as it deserved. He listened. He let her finish. Then he said, "What happened with Randall?" A pause. It didn't work out. "I'm sorry to hear it," he said, and meant that too. She looked at him. He could see that she was waiting for the conversation to turn toward the possibility she'd come here carrying, the door she was hoping he'd help her push open. He said, gently, "I think you're a good person, Renata. I do. I think you were in a place last year where you were trying to figure out what you needed, and I understand that. But I think you came in here today because something ended and you're looking for something familiar. And I don't think that's a fair reason to start something over." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is that really all it is to you?" she said. "Something familiar?" "I'm not saying that's all it is," he said. "I'm saying I don't think it's fair, to either of us, to try to answer that question from where you're standing right now." She left. He watched her go through the window, get into the Audi, and sit there for a moment before she started it. Priya appeared at his elbow. "You okay?" she said. "Fine," he said. "Go check on table 4. Frances Odell came to Almonte in April to finalize several things that needed finalizing in person. She was 63, precise in the way of people who had spent decades in rooms where precision was a form of courtesy. and she had known Everett long enough to know when to leave things alone. They sat in the back office of Lakeshore Grounds, with files spread across the prep table, and outside the door the cafe made its ordinary morning sounds. The espresso machine, the low voice of the radio, the bell above the entrance that had been loose in its fitting for 2 years and rattled in a way Everett kept meaning to fix. Francis went through the consolidated holdings. The Ottawa Valley properties, the investment portfolio, Harold's estate now folded in. She gave him the updated figure. He looked at it. "You should probably stop pretending to be the manager," she said. "I'm not pretending," he said. "I am the manager. Everett. I like the work, Francis." She looked at him over her glasses in a way that combined affection and exasperation into a single expression she'd had for years. "You know what I mean." "I do," he said, "and I don't want to change it." She shook her head, but she was smiling. "Has Megan seen these numbers?" "She knows. She's known for a while." He said it simply, without drama. "She doesn't talk about it, smart girl." "Very," he agreed. Francis gathered her papers. She had a meeting in Ottawa in the afternoon, a development group looking at a property in Canada that she thought might be worth the conversation. She left him with a folder, 2 signatures required, and the instruction to call her before the end of the week. After she left, he sat in the back office for a few minutes. He could hear Danny asking someone a question about the lunch prep. He could hear the loose bell above the door rattling as a customer came in. He picked up the folder, set it on the shelf where it would wait until evening, and went out front. That June, Megan came home for the summer. She'd taken a research position with a provincial watershed team based out of Carleton Place, 40 minutes east, which meant she could sleep in her own room and commute, which she preferred. She told him this on the phone in May, and the straightforwardness of it, that she wanted to come home, was the kind of thing that sat with him for days afterward. She arrived on a Friday evening with 2 bags and a cactus she'd transported in a milk crate on the passenger seat. She said the cactus was named Gerald. He did not ask questions. The first Saturday morning, she came downstairs at 7 to find him at the kitchen table, with a mug and a paperback the same as always. She poured herself coffee and sat across from him. They didn't speak for a few minutes. That was fine. They'd always been able to do that. Eventually she said, "How are you, actually?" He thought about it honestly, the way he always tried to do when she asked. "Good," he said. "I think genuinely good." She nodded slowly. "Renata, done, has been for a while. I know. I mean, how are you about it?" He looked at the window. The morning was clear. Robins in the cedar hedges along the back fence. "I think I learned something," he said, "about what I want, which is not nothing." She turned her coffee mug in her hands, the old one with the Guelph Griffons logo that was faded now to almost nothing. "She didn't see you," Megan said. "No," he said. "She didn't. Someone will." He smiled at that. Not a complicated smile, just the kind that means something is true. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. "I know you're not." She got up to top off her coffee. "There's a farmer's market in Almonte today. I want to go. We can go, and I want the shortbread. I already made it," he said. "It's in the tin on the counter." She looked at the counter. There was the tin where it always was. She looked back at him with an expression he'd seen her wear her whole life. Something between love and exasperation, and the specific tenderness that comes from knowing someone completely. "Okay," she said. "Give me 20 minutes." He went back to his book. The morning light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table in the slow, particular way it did in June in the Ottawa Valley, when the days were long and the air still held something gentle. Outside, a robin landed on the cedar hedge and held there a moment, considering something, and then lifted away into the clear blue of the morning. Everett Coombe turned a page and drank his coffee and waited.